The click of the lavatory door lock was the last sound of Caroline Finch's 30-year career. It was a small, insignificant noise, a tiny metallic tumbler falling into place, but it echoed with the finality of a guillotine. At that moment, suspended 7 miles above the Atlantic, she was the undisputed monarch of majestic Air Flight 712, a queen ruling a pressurized aluminum tube. In her mind, she was dispensing justice, teaching a lesson in discipline that a weak mother had clearly failed to impart. She had no idea that the faint, panicked drumming from inside that tiny room was the sound of her own world being hammered into ruin. She couldn't know that this one small act of casual cruelty, born of bitterness and a desperate need for control, would not just end her career but obliterate the very identity she had spent 3 decades building. It all began with a boy, his dead father's last gift, and a storm of malice that had been gathering in Caroline's soul for years. The air inside the terminal at New York's JFK was a familiar soup of stale coffee, anxiety, and disinfectant. Caroline Finch, at 58 years old, stood at the boarding gate with a posture as rigid as the fuselage of the Boeing 787 she was about to command. Her silver-blonde hair was lacquered into a perfect, immovable helmet. Her navy blue uniform was so sharply creased it looked like it could cut glass. To the airline executives who reviewed her file, she was a paragon of efficiency. A senior purser with a spotless record of on-time departures and 0 official complaints. They didn't see what the junior crew saw, a tyrant who patrolled the aisles like a prison warden, whose smile was a rictus of condescension and whose kindness was rationed more strictly than the first-class champagne. Power was Caroline's oxygen. On the ground, she was a divorced woman in a mortgaged condo, invisible to the world. But in the sky, she was law. She decided who got an extra blanket, whose carry-on was a fraction of an inch too large, and who would be withered by a glare for daring to press the call button for a trivial reason. "Boarding pass," she clipped, her voice devoid of warmth. A young couple, giddy with the excitement of their honeymoon, held up their phones. Caroline sighed, a theatrical exhalation of manufactured impatience. "Have it ready, please. You're holding up the line." She watched them scurry away, a flicker of satisfaction in her cold blue eyes. This was her domain. This was control. Then she saw them, Amelia Evans and her 8-year-old son, Samuel. Amelia looked worn, the way people do when they are carrying a grief that has no end. A faint shadow lived under her eyes, a permanent resident of loss. She was a music teacher from Ohio, and 6 months ago, her husband, David, had been killed by a drunk driver, leaving a hole in their lives as vast and empty as the sky outside. This trip was a pilgrimage of sorts, to take Samuel to see his paternal grandparents in London for the first time since the funeral. Samuel was a small, quiet boy with large, soulful eyes that seemed to absorb everything. He clutched a small, intricately carved wooden bird in his hand, its surface worn smooth by constant touch. It was the last thing his father had made for him in his workshop. It was more than a toy. It was a relic. Samuel also had a stutter, a frustrating snag in the fabric of his speech that grew worse when he was nervous or upset. It made him shy, hesitant to speak to strangers. "Good morning," Amelia said, offering a tired but genuine smile as she held out their boarding passes. Caroline's eyes bypassed Amelia's face and locked onto the wooden bird in Samuel's hand. Her lip curled in a micro-expression of disgust. "That needs to be stowed," she declared, her voice flat and absolute. Amelia blinked, startled. "I'm sorry?" "The wooden object," Caroline clarified, refusing to call it a toy. "It must be placed in a bag and stowed in the overhead compartment. It's a potential hazard." "It's just a small carving," Amelia said, her voice steady. "He holds it for comfort. It won't leave his hand, I promise." "Airline policy is not based on your promises," Caroline retorted, her voice rising just enough to make the people behind them shift uncomfortably. "If there's turbulence, it could become a projectile. If it splinters, it becomes a weapon. Stow it, or you can find another flight." It was a preposterous lie, a rule invented on the spot. But Caroline had spotted her targets. A weary, sad-eyed mother who likely wouldn't fight back, and a child who was different. Her predatory instinct to establish dominance, to find a crack in someone's composure and pry it open, was in full gear. Samuel, sensing the hostility aimed at his most precious possession, shrank behind his mother's legs, his grip on the bird tightening. He looked up at the stern woman in the uniform, his mouth opening and closing silently as he tried to form a word. No, he finally managed to whisper, the single word a monumental effort. Caroline leaned down, her face a mask of false concern that was more menacing than any scowl. What was that, young man? We use our words on an airplane. Amelia's spine stiffened. The gentle music teacher vanished, replaced by a mother bear. She placed a protective hand on Samuel's shoulder. Do not speak to my son that way. I will put the bird in my purse during takeoff and landing if that's what's required, but he is keeping it with him. Caroline straightened up, a venomous smile playing on her lips. She saw the line growing longer and knew the gate agent was watching. A public scene was inefficient. Fine, but if I see it out during the critical phases of flight, it will be confiscated. Row 42, all the way in the back. Move along. As Amelia guided a trembling Samuel down the jet bridge, Caroline turned to Chloe, a bright-eyed new flight attendant in her early 20s. Mark my words, Caroline hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. That one is going to be trouble. The mother has an attitude, and the boy is defective. Watch them. Chloe, who had learned in her first 2 weeks that survival meant nodding and obeying, simply said, Yes, Caroline. But as she watched the mother and son disappear into the cabin, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She saw a grieving family, not a threat, and that, she was beginning to realize, was the fundamental difference between her and the senior purser. The Boeing 787 climbed smoothly into the stratosphere, but the peace inside the cabin was a fragile veneer. Caroline patrolled the aisle with an eagle's gaze, searching for infractions. She scolded a man for having his laptop out 1 minute after the captain's announcement. She publicly chastised a teenager for letting his headphones be heard by the passenger next to him. Each small assertion of power was a balm to her withered soul. In row 42, nestled by the window, Samuel was struggling. The change in air pressure hurt his ears, and the confrontation at the gate had left him agitated. He was rocking slightly in his seat, a low hum vibrating in his chest. Amelia was a fortress of calm, rubbing his back and whispering stories about his father. She'd managed to get him to drink some water, and his ears had finally popped. A sudden, unexpected pocket of turbulence shook the aircraft. It wasn't severe, but it was abrupt. The half-full plastic cup of water on Samuel's tray table jumped, splashing a small amount onto the grey carpet in the aisle. It was a minor spill, the kind that happens a dozen times on any transatlantic flight, but Caroline, making a sweep of the rear cabin, saw it as a personal affront. She stopped, her body rigid, staring down at the damp patch as if it were a mortal wound. Seriously, she announced, her voice loud enough to pierce through the drone of the engines. Several passengers turned to look. Oh, I am so sorry, Amelia said instantly, grabbing a handful of napkins from her seat-back pocket. There was a bit of a jolt. The jolt didn't spill the water, he did, Caroline accused, pointing an imperious finger at Samuel, who flinched as if struck. Look at that, water seeping into the carpet. Do you know what that can do to the electronics running underneath? This is airline property. I'm cleaning it up, Amelia said, her voice strained. It's just water. Could I trouble you for a cloth? I am not a janitor, Caroline sneered, and he needs to stop that humming. It's disruptive. The fire in Amelia's eyes, banked for months by grief, flared to life. He is scared. And you are making it infinitely worse. It's just water. Please, just leave us alone. Caroline let out a short, sharp laugh. Oh, I see. You're one of those parents, the ones who think their special child is exempt from all rules of civilized behavior. Control your son, or I will have Captain Davies meet you at the gate in London. She spun on her heel and marched back to the galley, leaving Amelia shaking with a silent, helpless rage. Samuel had buried his face in her side, his small shoulders trembling. Chloe, witnessing the exchange from the galley, felt a surge of shame. She wanted to take a towel to the woman, to offer a kind word, but the memory of Caroline dressing down another new hire until she cried was still fresh. So, like a coward, she turned and busied herself counting beverage cans. It was a small failure of courage, but it would have devastating consequences. 3 hours into the 7-hour flight, a quiet rhythm had settled over the cabin. The lights were dimmed and the glow of screens flickered in the darkness. Caroline was in the rear galley, complaining to another flight attendant about the declining quality of passengers. But one eye was always on the aisle, a predator waiting. Samuel had finally calmed down. He was watching a cartoon, the wooden bird resting on his lap. But the water he'd drunk earlier had worked its way through his small system. "Mommy, I have to use the bathroom," he whispered, tugging on her sleeve. Amelia looked toward the back of the plane. The seatbelt sign was off. The lavatories were just a few rows away, near the galley where she could see Caroline's silhouette. She hesitated. "Do you want me to come with you, sweetie?" Samuel shook his head. He was 8 and using the restroom by himself was a point of pride, a small island of independence in his turbulent world. "I can do it." Amelia's heart ached with a mixture of pride and fear. "Okay, be quick. If that lady says anything, you just ignore her and come right back to me. Don't talk to her." "Okay, Mommy." He unbuckled his seatbelt, slid past her, and began the short walk down the aisle, the wooden bird held tightly in his hand. As he approached the galley, Caroline stopped her conversation. She watched him, her eyes narrowed to slits. Samuel kept his own eyes fixed on the floor, trying to make himself invisible. He reached for the handle of the vacant lavatory. "And where do you think you're going?" Caroline's voice sliced through the quiet hum of the cabin. Samuel froze. B bathroom," he stammered, the word a painful series of stops and starts. A cruel, twisted idea began to blossom in the barren garden of Caroline's mind. She was bored. She was simmering with resentment for the mother who had defied her. This was a perfect, untraceable opportunity to exert her power. "Fine," she said, her voice suddenly dripping with a false, saccharine sweetness. "In you go. But don't take all day." Samuel scurried into the small compartment. The door clicked shut. The moment it did, Caroline moved. "What are you doing?" The other flight attendant, a man named Mark, asked nervously. "Teaching a masterclass in respect," Caroline whispered with a conspiratorial wink. She reached into the small kit in her apron and pulled out a metal pin, the kind used for resetting electronics, or, in this case, for the emergency override on the lavatory lock. The locks on the 787 were designed to be opened from the outside in an emergency. But they also had a flaw Caroline had discovered long ago. If you engaged the exterior lock and then used a pin to depress the manual reset tumbler at just the right angle, you could jam the internal bolt. It wouldn't just be locked, it would be mechanically seized. With practiced precision, she turned the exterior latch to occupied, then inserted the pin into the tiny hole beneath it, wiggling it until she felt a faint click. The handle was now immovable from the inside. For good measure, for the sheer theatricality of it, she took the heavy metal bar used to secure the beverage cart and wedged it diagonally against the door and the galley frame. It was now barricaded. Inside, Samuel finished and washed his hands. He reached for the handle. It wouldn't budge. He tried again, pushing with all his might. Nothing. The small, windowless room suddenly felt like a coffin. The constant low roar of the engines, usually just background noise, seemed to amplify, pressing in on him. Hello?" he called out, his voice small and thin. He knocked on the door. "It's stuck." Outside, Caroline leaned against the counter, a smug, satisfied smile on her face. "Caroline, for God's sake, let him out," Mark hissed, his face pale. "He's just a kid." "Relax, Mark," she snapped, her voice low and dangerous. A few minutes of quiet time never hurt anyone. Let him think about his behavior. It's what his mother should be doing. Mark, a man with 2 years until retirement and no desire to make waves, retreated to the front of the galley and said nothing more. Inside, panic was beginning to ferment into terror. Samuel started banging on the door, his small fists making a dull thudding sound. "Mommy, let me out. Mummy." Back in row 42, Amelia glanced at her watch. 4 minutes. It felt like an eternity. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, crept up her spine. She unbuckled her belt and stood, her eyes scanning the aisle toward the rear of the plane. She saw the galley, she saw Caroline casually flipping through a magazine, but she didn't see Samuel. She moved into the aisle. As she drew closer, she heard it. A muffled, high-pitched cry, a sound of pure terror that any mother would recognize in an instant. "Samuel!" She broke into a run. She burst into the galley, her eyes wild. "Where is my son?" she demanded. Caroline looked up, feigning a bored surprise. "I'm sure he's fine. The lavatory is occupied. You'll have to wait." But Amelia could hear the frantic pounding from inside the door. "Samuel, baby, I'm here." From within, a choked sob. Mommy, it's dark. I can't open it." Amelia grabbed the handle. It was solid, unmoving. Her eyes darted around and saw the heavy metal bar wedged against the door. She looked at the lock indicator, jammed at a strange angle. Then she looked at Caroline Finch, and she saw it. The faint, triumphant smirk dancing on her lips. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. "You locked him in," she whispered, her voice a cocktail of disbelief and rising fury. "You locked my son in the bathroom." "Don't be absurd," Caroline said smoothly, her composure perfect. "The lock is probably broken. That child was fiddling with everything. He likely damaged it himself." "Open this door," Amelia screamed, lunging forward and grabbing the lapels of Caroline's jacket. This was the moment Caroline had been waiting for, physical contact. "Assault," she shrieked, her voice suddenly loud and theatrical for the benefit of the nearby passengers. "I am being assaulted. This passenger is attacking a crew member." Chloe and Mark came running. Passengers started to stand up, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Get your hands off me." Caroline shoved Amelia backward. "You are interfering with the flight crew. That is a federal crime." Amelia ignored the threats. She threw herself at the door, her fists beating against the composite material. "Samuel, honey, it's okay. Mommy's going to get you out. Just breathe." But inside, Samuel couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in, the air was thick and stale, and his mother's voice was a muffled sound from a world away. His stutter had taken over completely, his throat closing up as he gasped for air, hyperventilating in the dark. Then there was a loud, sickening thud against the inside of the door. And then silence. The frantic pounding stopped. The crying stopped. Amelia froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. "Samuel?" No answer. "Samuel!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. Only the hum of the engines replied. Amelia turned slowly, her gaze falling upon Caroline. The grief and fear in her eyes had been burned away, replaced by something cold, hard and lethal. It was the look of a woman who had already lost half her world and was on the verge of losing the rest. "If he is not okay," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never see the sun again." For the first time that day, a genuine flicker of fear entered Caroline Finch's eyes. The silence from the bathroom was not part of her script. "Mark, get the emergency toolkit," she stammered. "You won't need it." The voice was quiet, calm, and came from the aisle. An elderly man in a tweed jacket, who had been sitting in row 40, stepped forward. He had been watching the entire exchange over the top of his reading glasses. He moved past Amelia, his movements slow but deliberate. "Ma'am, please let me see." Caroline tried to block him. "Sir, return to your seat. This is a crew matter." The man, Mr. Henderson, paid her no mind. He knelt, his old bones creaking, and examined the door. He pointed a thin, steady finger at the lock. "She didn't just lock it," he said, his voice surprisingly clear and authoritative. "She used a pin to jam the reset tumbler. The bar is just for show, to intimidate. The real problem is in the mechanism." He looked up at Caroline. "I'm a retired civil engineer. I know a jammed bolt when I see one." He turned to his wife, who was standing in the aisle, her face a mask of worry. "Eleanor, dear, could I borrow your hairpin?" The cabin had descended into a state of suspended chaos. The low hum of the engines was now a backdrop to a drama unfolding in the rear galley, a drama that had captivated every conscious passenger on Flight 712. Phones were out, not just recording, but live streaming the event to a world that was just waking up. Caroline Finch stood cornered, her carefully constructed authority disintegrating with each passing second. "Everyone sit down," she shrieked, her voice a shrill, cracking command that had lost all its power. "This is a restricted area. Return to your seats." "We're not going anywhere until that boy is out," a man from row 38 shouted, his voice resonating with the anger of the crowd. It was a mutiny at 37,000 feet. The unwritten rule of passenger deference had been shattered by an act of indefensible cruelty. Amelia Evans remained on the floor, her body a statue of terror, her ear pressed against the cold lavatory door, praying for a sound, any sound from her son. Mr. Henderson, the elderly engineer, was the center of calm in the swirling storm. He ignored Caroline completely. Eleanor, his wife of 50 years, handed him a simple, sturdy hairpin. With the focused precision of a man who had spent his life solving mechanical problems, he inserted the pin into the tiny reset hole beneath the lock. "She's pushed the pin too far inward, engaging the deadlocking plate," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Need to gently push it back to the neutral position without snapping the spring." He manipulated the hairpin with delicate twists. The passengers watched in breathless silence. Even Amelia held her breath. There was a soft click. Mr. Henderson removed the hairpin. He pulled the wedged metal bar away from the door and tossed it to the floor with a loud clang. Then he turned the exterior lock. It moved freely. He pulled the door open. Amelia fell to her knees and peered inside. Samuel was crumpled on the floor in a fetal position, his face pale and clammy, his lips tinged with blue. He was unconscious. He had hyperventilated until he'd passed out. "Samuel!" Amelia's cry was a raw, primal sound of a mother's worst fear realized. She gathered his limp body into her arms, pulling him out into the galley. "I need the medical kit. Now! He's not breathing properly." "I'm a teacher. I know CPR." Chloe, the junior flight attendant, finally broke free from her paralysis of fear. She scrambled to the overhead compartment, pulling down the heavy red medical bag and the green oxygen cylinder. Caroline watched, her face the color of ash. "He fainted," she muttered, as if trying to convince herself. "He's just being dramatic. He did it to himself." "I have it all on video," a young woman in a college sweatshirt said, holding her phone up from 3 rows back. "I saw you jam the lock. I heard you tell your colleague to let him cry. I have everything." Caroline's world tilted on its axis. "That's illegal," she screeched, lunging toward the student. "You can't record on an aircraft. Give me that phone." Mr. Henderson stepped between them. "I'd advise against that, madam," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I believe you are in quite enough trouble." The captain's voice finally crackled over the PA system, but his words were lost in the pandemonium. Tasha was fitting the small oxygen mask over Samuel's nose and mouth. His eyelids fluttered. He took a ragged, gasping breath, and then another. His eyes opened, wide with terror, and he began to cry, a weak, broken whimper that was more heartbreaking than any scream. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here," Amelia wept, rocking him gently. She looked up, her gaze locking with Caroline's. There was no shouting, no threats, just a cold, final judgment in her eyes. "You are finished," she said. Caroline drew herself up, a cornered animal preparing for its last stand. "We'll see about that. When we land, you'll be in handcuffs for assault and inciting a riot." She grabbed the inter-cabin phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the cockpit. "Captain Davies," she said, her voice a strained attempt at professionalism. "We have an emergency. A passenger has assaulted me and is leading a riot in the rear cabin. We need to divert immediately." Chloe, standing by the mid-cabin phone, watched in horror. She saw Amelia cradling her terrified child. She saw Mr. Henderson calmly explaining to other passengers what had happened. She saw the video cameras, and she saw Caroline weaving a monstrous lie to save her own skin. In that moment, Chloe made a decision. She snatched her own handset. "Captain, this is Chloe," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "That's not true, sir. Caroline locked a child in the lavatory. He passed out. The passengers are upset, but no one is rioting. Please, Captain, you need to come back here." "Chloe, you sniveling little traitor!" Caroline's scream echoed from the phone. In the cockpit, Captain Alistair Davies, a veteran pilot with a calm demeanor and a low tolerance for nonsense, listened to the conflicting reports. He'd flown with Caroline Finch for years. He knew she was a petty tyrant, but this was a new level of insanity. Hijacking and riot were words with serious consequences. Chloe's terrified, earnest voice sounded far more credible. First officer, you have the controls, Davies said, unbuckling his seatbelt. Lock this door. Do not open it for anyone but me. Code word is Stilton. He put on his captain's hat, the 4 gold stripes a symbol of ultimate authority, and stepped out of the cockpit. He walked through the silent business-class cabin and into the low-grade chaos of economy. The sight of the captain marching down the aisle had an immediate quieting effect. He reached the rear galley. The scene was damning. A mother on the floor with a child on oxygen. A crowd of angry but not violent passengers. And Caroline Finch, looking wild-eyed and cornered. "Report," Davies commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. "Captain, thank God," Caroline began, launching into her prepared narrative. "This woman attacked me, her child damaged the aircraft, and these passengers are out of control." Davies held up a hand, silencing her. He looked at Amelia. "Ma'am, are you and your son all right?" "She locked him in that bathroom," Amelia said, her voice shaking with contained fury. "On purpose. He has a severe stutter. He couldn't call for help. He passed out from fear." Davies's eyes fell on Mr. Henderson. "And you, sir?" "I witnessed the purser deliberately jam the lavatory lock from the outside using a pin," Henderson stated with the clarity of an expert witness. "It was a malicious act, not a malfunction. Several passengers have it recorded." Davies turned his gaze, cold and hard, upon Caroline. "Did you lock a passenger in the lavatory, Ms. Finch?" I secured the door," she stammered. "The child was being unruly. He needed a time out." A collective gasp went through the nearby passengers. The admission, so callous and self-assured, hung in the air. Captain Davies stared at her for a long, silent moment. The disappointment on his face was more profound than any anger. "Caroline, you are a flight attendant, not a child psychologist. You don't give timeouts at 37,000 feet by locking children in a closet." He took a deep breath. "Caroline Finch, as captain of this aircraft, I am officially relieving you of your duties, effective immediately." The words struck Caroline with the force of a physical blow. "What? Alistair, you can't be serious. We're over the ocean. I'm the senior purser." "Not anymore," Davies said, his voice like chips of ice. "You are a danger to the passengers and a disgrace to this airline. Give your master key to Chloe." "No." Caroline clutched her apron pocket. "This is my cabin." "Give her the key," Davies repeated, taking a step closer, his sheer presence overwhelming, "or I will have these gentlemen restrain you." With a hand trembling with pure rage, Caroline pulled out the keys and threw them onto the galley counter. "You'll be hearing from my union. You are destroying my career based on the word of hysterical passengers." "Your career is the least of your worries," Davies said grimly. "Mark, escort Miss Finch to seat 42B, the middle seat." "I will not sit in economy," she gasped, horrified. "Jump seats are for active crew," the captain said. "You are now a passenger on a full flight. That is the only seat available. Take it. Now." Defeated, humiliated, Caroline Finch was forced to perform the longest walk of her life. As she moved down the aisle, a gauntlet of glares and whispered insults followed her. Monster. Wicked. Child abuser. Phones were held high, recording her walk of shame. As she passed Amelia, who was now being attended to by Chloe, their eyes met across the small expanse of the galley. Caroline's were twin shards of blue ice, blazing with a hateful fire that promised retribution. Amelia's, however, were not filled with the fear or anger Caroline expected. They held a profound, weary sorrow, the look of a woman who had already weathered the worst storm of her life and found this one, while terrifying, merely a squall. In that gaze, Caroline saw not a victim, but a judge, and for the first time, a cold tendril of genuine dread coiled in her gut. She was forced into the middle seat in the last row, a cruel irony that placed her right next to the very lavatory she had used as a prison cell. The door, now slightly ajar, seemed to mock her. She was wedged between a large, unpleasantly fragrant man who had already begun to snore and the cold plastic of the cabin wall. The uniform, once a suit of armor that imbued her with near absolute power, now felt like a costume, a ridiculous shroud of an identity that had been stripped from her. She was powerless, invisible, just another anonymous body in a pressurized tube hurtling toward a future she could no longer control. Every whisper from the rows ahead was about her. Every phone screen she glimpsed seemed to display her face, twisted in a snarl of impotent rage. The world she had commanded was now a jury box, and every single occupant had already found her guilty. In the forward galley, a space that felt a world away, Captain Davies knelt, his posture one of sincere contrition. He had taken off his hat, a gesture of respect that felt monumental. "Ma'am," he said to Amelia, his voice low and steady, "on behalf of every decent person who wears this uniform, I am profoundly, deeply sorry. Words are inadequate. I have radioed ahead. A dedicated medical team and police will meet us at the gate. We are, of course, moving you and your son to the first-class cabin for the remainder of the flight. There is a lie-flat bed. He needs peace, and you need a moment to breathe." He then looked at Samuel, who was now awake, his small body still trembling in his mother's arms. The captain reached up and unpinned the small golden wings from his own lapel. "Young man," he said softly, "every pilot gets a set of these. They mean you're brave enough to fly through any storm. I think you've earned these today." He gently pinned them to Samuel's shirt. Amelia, cradling her son, could only manage a choked nod, tears of relief and gratitude finally tracing paths through the exhaustion on her face. Samuel looked at the wings, then at the captain, and a tiny, fragile smile touched his lips. It was the first glimmer of light after a long, terrifying darkness. As Captain Davies made his way back to the cockpit, he was blissfully unaware that he was no longer just the captain of an aircraft, but a minor character in a global news event. The college student's live stream, titled "Majestic Air Attendant Abuses and Imprisons Disabled Child," had not just been picked up by aggregators, it had been weaponized by the internet. It was being played on loop on every major news network. The video of Mr. Henderson, the retired engineer, calmly explaining the mechanics of the jammed lock with his wife's hairpin, had transformed him into an unlikely folk hero, his quiet competence a perfect foil to Caroline's shrieking panic. The hashtag #Justice for Samuel was not just trending. It was a planetary phenomenon, a digital tidal wave of collective outrage. By the time the Boeing 787 began its graceful descent through the grey cloud cover over London, the stock price of Majestic Air's parent company had hemorrhaged value, a 7% drop that represented billions in market capitalization. The CEO, Marcus Thorne, had been roused from his bed by a call from his head of communications, a woman whose voice was tight with a terror usually reserved for engine failure. An emergency board meeting was already in session via video conference, its participants a gallery of grim, pale faces staring out from their home offices. Caroline Finch believed she was flying toward a contentious meeting with her union representative. In reality, she was flying into the epicenter of a corporate and legal firestorm that she herself had ignited with a simple metal pin. Her life, as she had meticulously constructed it, was already a smoking ruin. She was just the last to know. The touchdown at Heathrow was textbook perfect, a gentle kiss of rubber on asphalt that was a profound betrayal of the tempest that awaited. As the 787 taxied toward Terminal 5, the usual post-flight rustle of unbuckling belts and retrieving bags was eerily absent. A tense, expectant silence gripped the cabin. The seatbelt sign pinged off, but was immediately superseded by Captain Davies's voice, calm and authoritative, over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. For your own safety and to cooperate with the authorities on the ground, I must insist that everyone remain in their seats with your seatbelts fastened until instructed otherwise. Please do not stand up or open the overhead bins. The ground crew will not be opening the doors for deplaning just yet." Wedged in 42B, Caroline felt a surge of vindictive, delusional hope. Authorities. They were here. They would take statements. They would see that she was the one who had been assaulted, her authority undermined. They were here for the hysterical mother, for the meddling old man who had damaged the door, for the insolent girl who had filmed her. Justice, her brand of justice, was about to be served. The jet bridge connected with a hollow thud that echoed in the silent cabin. The main door was opened not by a smiling gate agent, but by two uniformed Metropolitan Police constables and a woman in a sharply tailored dark suit. Her name was Detective Inspector Isha Sharma, and her expression was one of polite professional implacability. Captain Davies met them at the threshold, handing over a thick, handwritten report that detailed the incident. He spoke in a low, urgent voice, gesturing with his head toward the rear of the aircraft. The two officers and the detective began their slow walk down the aisle. The passengers, a captive audience, parted like the Red Sea. Their faces were a gallery of emotions: grim satisfaction, pity, morbid curiosity. Caroline watched their approach, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. Her vindication. They passed the college student, who met their gaze without flinching. They passed Mr. Henderson, who gave a solemn, respectful nod. They walked right past Amelia and Samuel, who were being escorted by a compassionate Chloe toward the front. They didn't stop. Their footsteps were measured, relentless, a slow drumbeat of doom. They stopped when their shadows fell across row 42, engulfing Caroline Finch in darkness. "Are you Miss Caroline Finch?" Detective Inspector Sharma asked. Her voice was calm, level, and utterly devoid of emotion. "I am the senior purser on this flight," Caroline announced, her voice a brittle attempt to reclaim her lost authority. "And I am glad you are here. I need to file a report regarding an assault and a passenger inciting a riot." "Ms. Finch," the inspector cut her off, the words as clean and sharp as a scalpel. "I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of false imprisonment and causing grievous bodily harm to a minor. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." The world dissolved into a high-pitched ringing in Caroline's ears. The faces of the passengers blurred into a smear of color. "This is a mistake," she gasped, the words catching in her throat. "A complete misunderstanding. I am the victim here. She attacked me." "Please stand up, madam, and place your hands behind your back," one of the constables said, his voice a polite but firm monotone. He produced a pair of gleaming steel handcuffs. Panic, raw and animalistic, finally broke through her shock. She began to struggle, to flail in the cramped, undignified space. "No, you can't do this. I have rights. I have a union. This is absurd." Her resistance was as futile as it was pathetic. The officers were practiced, efficient, and unmoved. Within seconds, her arms were wrenched behind her back with painful precision, and the cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. The sound was not loud, but in the tomb-like silence of the cabin, it was a deafening finality. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on her entire life. As they hauled her, stumbling into the aisle, the silence broke. A single passenger in row 35 began to clap, a slow, deliberate, percussive sound. Then another joined in, and another, until the entire aircraft, from the lie-flat beds of first class to the rear galley, was filled with a thunderous, sustained applause. It was not a sound of joy, but of catharsis. It was the sound of 300 souls witnessing the swift, brutal, and deeply satisfying fall of a petty tyrant. Her face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a physical fire. Humiliated beyond her wildest nightmares, Caroline was marched down the aisle, a forced parade past every passenger she had ever disdained. She saw their faces clearly now: contempt, disgust, and a cold, righteous anger. She was forced to walk past Amelia, who stood by the open door, holding Samuel's hand. The boy was awake, his eyes wide, the gold captain's wings gleaming on his shirt. He looked at the woman in handcuffs, his small brow furrowed, not with fear, but with a child's simple, devastating logic. Is the bad lady going to time out now?" he asked his mother, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed galley. Amelia knelt, smoothing his hair, her body a shield between her son and the woman who had hurt him. "Yes, my love," she whispered, her eyes meeting Caroline's over his head, her gaze level and unbreakable. "A very, very long time out." Caroline was shoved onto the jet bridge and into the harsh, unforgiving grey light of a London afternoon. The applause from the plane faded, only to be replaced by a new, more terrifying sound: the frantic, percussive clicking of dozens of camera shutters. A horde of press, tipped off by the viral storm, was waiting for her, a feeding frenzy of lenses and microphones. Her face, contorted in a mask of rage, disbelief, and utter humiliation, was broadcast live across the globe, the final damning image of her spectacular self-immolation. While Caroline was being processed in a sterile, windowless room at Heathrow Police Station, Stripped, searched, and photographed like a common criminal, the corporate machinery of Majestic Air was operating at Redline. The video of the incident, now with over 100 million views, was a public relations cataclysm of unprecedented scale. The CEO, Marcus Thorne, a man whose face was now a permanent mask of grave concern, delivered his second press conference of the day. The actions of this one individual represent a sickening and profound betrayal of the trust our passengers place in us every single day, he read from a teleprompter, his voice resonating with carefully rehearsed sincerity. Ms. Finch's employment has been terminated, effective immediately and with extreme prejudice. We have reached out to the Evans family to offer our deepest, unreserved apologies and our full, unconditional support, financial and otherwise. Furthermore, we are launching a root and branch review of our in-flight culture and training procedures to ensure that such a horrific event is not only never repeated, but is rendered impossible. Caroline's union, seeing the tidal wave of public fury and the mountain of digital evidence, issued a terse two-sentence statement condemning her actions as indefensible and contrary to the values of our members, and confirming they would not be providing her with legal representation. In the space of a single transatlantic flight, she had become utterly toxic, an outcast from the only world she had ever known, abandoned by every institution she had once served. The legal process was a swift and brutal demolition, faced with crystal-clear video evidence from multiple angles. The calm, damningly precise testimony of a respected engineer, the tearful but resolute account of a junior flight attendant, and the quiet, powerful statement of a grieving mother, Caroline had no defense. Her publicly funded solicitor, a weary young man who had seen it all, advised her that her only conceivable path was to plead guilty and throw herself upon the mercy of the court. 6 months later, in a sterile London courtroom, Caroline Finch stood in the dock. She was a ghost of her former self. Her silver-blonde hair was limp and streaked with grey, its lacquered helmet long gone. Her sharp suits were replaced by a shapeless, ill-fitting grey dress. She looked smaller, diminished, stripped of the uniform that had been her very identity. The judge, a woman with piercing eyes and a voice that tolerated no falsehood, looked down at her from the bench. "You were entrusted with the care, comfort, and ultimate safety of your passengers," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, righteous anger. "You held a position of significant power and authority, a power granted to you on the assumption of professionalism and compassion. You chose to wield that power to terrorize a vulnerable 8-year-old child, a child already struggling with the unimaginable grief of losing his father. Your actions were not a mistake in judgment, they were a deliberate, calculated act of sadism, performed for your own cruel amusement. It is the duty of this court to send an unequivocal message that such a monstrous abuse of trust will not be tolerated." The judge paused, her gaze sweeping over Caroline's crumbling form. "I sentence you to 4 years in prison." A choked animal sob escaped Caroline's lips as her legs gave way. She crumpled, a puppet with its strings cut, and was dragged from the dock by 2 impassive security guards. Her career was not just over. It had been publicly and ceremoniously incinerated on a pyre of her own making. 3 years later, on a bright, sun-drenched afternoon in a small Ohio town, Amelia Evans sat in the front row of a school auditorium. On the stage, an 11-year-old Samuel stood at a lectern, poised and taller than she could believe. In his hand, he held the small, intricately carved wooden bird. He took a deep, centering breath. My dad made this for me," he began. The stutter was still there, a faint echo, but it was no longer a wall. It was just a part of the rhythm of his speech. His voice was clear and confident. "He told me it was a kestrel. He said it's a special bird because it can fly higher than any other, even in the biggest storm. He told me that no matter how hard the wind blows, no matter how dark the clouds get, you just have to keep your wings steady and trust they'll carry you through." Amelia's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of a pride so overwhelming it felt like it could lift her from her seat. The settlement from Majestic Air had provided financial security, but its true value was in funding the very best speech therapy and trauma counseling for Samuel. More than that, Amelia, in a move that stunned the airline's executives, had refused to simply take the money and disappear. She had worked with them, forcing them to create the Samuel's Wing Initiative, a mandatory new training module for all flight crews designed by child psychologists and disability advocates on how to interact with compassion and understanding toward children with visible and invisible challenges. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, the engineer and his wife, were now honorary grandparents, their annual summer visit a cherished tradition. Far away in a bleak, rain-swept industrial town in the north of England, a woman named Caroline pushed a clattering metal cage of milk cartons across the floor of a 24-hour supermarket. She worked the night shift, a condition of her parole forbidding her from any customer-facing role. She was anonymous, invisible, a ghost haunting the fluorescent-lit aisles. Her once immaculate hands were now chapped and rough. Her back ached with a dull, constant fire. Sometimes, during her 3 a.m. break, she would stand in the empty, sodium-lit car park and watch the first red-eye flights of the day streak across the dark, pre-dawn sky, their lights blinking silently in the vast emptiness. She would remember the feeling of the uniform, the hum of the engines, the sensation of power, of control, of being the undisputed queen of her own small, airborne kingdom. Then she would look down at her worn, faded blue smock, the plastic name tag that simply read staff, and the feeling that replaced the memory was not remorse, not sadness, but a hollow, echoing void. She had wanted to teach a child a lesson in respect. In the end, the universe had taught her the hardest lesson of all: that cruelty is a cage, meticulously constructed one small, bitter act at a time, and most often, the one who builds it is the one who ends up trapped inside, staring up at a sky they can never reach again.